My friends, the mainstream media narrative is that Russian casualties are so high that the Russian army needs to desperately recruit thousands of foreigners from all over the world to fill in the gaps.
These prisoners of war come from Cuba, Somalia, Nepal, India and Sierra Leone. They're foreign mercenaries recruited by the Russian army, now detained in Ukraine.
German media Deutsche Welle is coping hard given the significant losses, aka an average of 913 soldiers a day. And of course, what is the solution? Foreigners in the service of Russians. How they strengthen the enemy. This Telegram channel even reported, due to severe shortages of troops, Russians started recruiting Sri Lankans. The orcs need more meat to the front. Except all these so-called news are loaded with propaganda. So today I will debunk a lot of this nonsense. Same thing for the claims that there's mass desertion and even mutinies among these foreign recruits. It's funny, they never use the words mass desertion when thousands of fighters of the International Legion simply left the front and went home. With that being said, the story of these foreign recruits that ended up in the Russian armed forces is pretty tragic. Most of them come from poor countries. They didn't join for ideological reasons, but down-to-earth financial ones, in order to help provide for their families. Now look at them. Do you really think these guys are Sturm Battalion material? Most of them don't even speak Russian.
English.
I don't think Russia actually needs foreign recruits. And you'll see why throughout this video. Especially if the majority of them don't even have any military experience whatsoever. If anything, they're more of an annoyance for Russian authorities, because all this also creates numerous diplomatic problems.
Fuck.
CNN talks of thousands of losses in the ranks of the foreign mercenaries fighting for Russia. But if we look at the facts, as of the 12th of July, 220 foreigners were reported and confirmed as KIA according to the website Mediazona. Other sources mentioned that as of December 2023, at least 254 foreign citizens were KIA in Ukraine as part of Russian armed forces. We're very far from thousands of casualties.
You just need to believe.
Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. Let's start with Syria. We all remember this rumor from the first months of the war, where supposedly Russia was going to deploy up to 20,000 Syrian and Libyan mercenaries in the Donbass. And the funniest thing is that it even says that the source is an anonymous European official in Washington. Oh, what a surprise. Turns out it was all fake. In this article by Ukrainian media Apostorov, the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine has published a list of mercenaries from Syria, whom the Russian Federation recruited to participate in the war against Ukraine. My friends, there are 141 names on the list. 141. That's almost 150 times less than what was publicly announced. Actually, this is a pretty good summary of the coverage of the Ukraine war by the mainstream media. Random sources always come before cold, factual data. Now let's take a look at the infamous Cuban troops.
Puerto, viva la Cuba! Viva! Cuba libre!
In this video, we see a group of 15 to 20 Cuban soldiers. They are located in a very special military training base, the one of the 106 Guards Airborne Division in Tula. Here we see another squad of about 10 men from Cuba. And while digging on Reddit, I found more pictures. For example, in this picture, I see 16 Cuban fighters. And interestingly, it seems to be the same guys from the previous video. I think I recognize some of them. This Telegram post added the following note. Just like the good old days of the Cold War, we are with the Cubans against the Western imperialists. As a matter of fact, some of the Cubans enlisted just because of that. One wrote on social media, "My father went to Angola. All my male ancestors were in some war, and I want to follow their path." He's referring to the Cuban intervention in Angola. Over the course of the war from 1975 to 1991, over 300,000 Cubans were deployed in Africa. At the peak of their involvement, there were about 36,000 Cubans stationed in Angola. However, this situation is completely different in Ukraine. The BBC actually wrote an article on these Cuban mercenaries. How Russia lures Cubans to war with Ukraine. Here in this picture it even says, Marilyn Vinent shows a photo of her son Denis, who went to Russia to work in construction but ended up in the army. Because of that, on the 8th of September 2023, Cuban officials said they had arrested 17 people in connection with the alleged trafficking scheme. As you can see, the main motivation to go to Russia is money. That's why we can talk of mercenaries. Cuban volunteers in the Russian armed forces would get over $2,000 a month, a huge sum in Cuba, where the average monthly salary is less than $50. And if the soldier gets KIA, the family in Cuba would get $21,000. On top of that, these foreign recruits can also get Russian citizenship after their contract ends in the military. I'll show you parts of this interesting interview of a Cuban mercenary that was captured in Marinka. This is what he had to say.
Yo no vine a la guerra porque la página decía que uno venía aquí a trabajar en la plomería, albañilería, carpintería. Ese era el contrato. Pero no es tirar tiro porque por lo menos yo hablo por mi persona. Por lo menos yo no tengo entrenamiento militar. Nosotros nos pusieron el contrato en ruso y te hacen firmar creyendo, ¿me entiendes? De que es la labor esa que tú viniste. Y ya ahí cuando tú te das cuenta estás en un búnker y estás tirando tiro en una trinchera.
Apparently the conditions are so bad that a unit of Cubans attached to the 428th Motorized Rifle Regiment near Donetsk fragged their commander. I quote, "The reason was constant humiliation, beatings, and deprivation of wages from migrant workers from Latin America." This entire story stems from the information of an anonymous Atesh agent, a Ukrainian partisan operating behind enemy lines in occupied territory. There's no picture, no video, no sort of evidence. And if that mutiny was legit, we all know how the Russians would have handled the situation. According to the pro-Ukrainian platform Inform Nepal, by October 2023, 200 Cubans allegedly served in the Russian army. Meanwhile, Reuters could confirm the presence of 119 Cuban citizens in the zone of operations. The Time talked to some Cuban human rights group in Miami, and they were able to track 746 Cuban recruits. It seems they were numerous enough to form all Cuban units. For example, the one captured in Marinka said there were 35 Cubans in his platoon. As of now in 2024, it is believed that one of the Cuban commanding officers is thought to be Lázaro González. In a special interview on the radio, he even claimed to have 90 Cubans under his command. The representative of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry in Latin America and the Caribbean told the Wall Street Journal that there were about 400 Latinos in the Russian military. So we can safely assume a majority of them are Cubans, but there are also Colombians, Mexicans, and so on. What's interesting is that most of these foreign mercenaries are immediately sent to the Donetsk front, probably to fill up the depleted DPR brigades. I estimate around 1,500 to 2,000 foreign recruits in the ranks of the Russian armed forces since the beginning of the war. Max 3,000 if we really stretch it. Like we've seen, there are some Hispanic detachments, platoon-sized units of 30 to 40 men. But in reality, such ethnic units are relatively rare. Spoilers, I heard there's also a Sri Lankan one. Long story short, every foreign recruit goes through basic training, and after that they go through some sort of selection. Using a drone, the battalion commander assesses every recruit's military skills in various tasks. The ones that display the best skills join Storm units. The others are attached to various DPR brigades for support roles. Somewhere at the rear, like logistics, digging trenches, building drones, making coffee, I don't know. However, they will still be within a war zone and face enemy artillery fire and FPV drone strikes. Now, my little birds told me there are also a good amount of recruits from former Soviet republics who have volunteered for the special military operation. From what I read, it's mostly citizens from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan specifically, and a few from Kazakhstan. Now, contrary to other foreign recruits, the benefit is that the majority of Central Asians speak Russian. For example, here you can see a Russian soldier from Tajikistan talking about his experience at the front. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians released this footage of 20-year-old Bunyod Jurayev from Tajikistan, who surrendered to them in November 2023. Some of these Central Asians joined the war early on, like 19-year-old Zikirulu Ganiev, who enlisted already in March 2022. Like all the others, he was immediately assigned to a unit of foreign volunteers in a brigade of the DPR. He got wounded by shrapnel around June 2023, but he said once he's back on his feet, he will return to the front. There are two ways most of these Central Asian recruits ended up in the Russian military. Number one, recruitment occurs directly in their home country, via a Russian human resources company called Meros. Number two, recruits people from prisons, or that are in an illegal situation in the Russian Federation. In 2019, there were about 1.2 million Tajiks residing in Russia, plus an unknown amount of undocumented migrants. Let's say there is a police raid somewhere in a big city like Moscow or St. Petersburg, and they catch a bunch of undocumented people from Central Asia. The migrants are given a choice. Either you sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense, or you will be deported with no possibility to ever return. And that's a very tough choice, knowing that there's absolutely no work whatsoever in Tajikistan. This is what happened to this 45-year-old father of four. He was caught in one of such raids, was sent to basic training, and at once he became a rifleman in the 237th Tank Regiment. We know his story because on the 7th of July, he surrendered to the Ukrainians. In the fall of 2023, the Minister of Internal Affairs of Tajikistan stated that about 100 of their citizens were serving sentences in Russian prisons and sent to fight in Ukraine, out of an estimated 10,000 Tajik inmates. That's 1%. Not very successful recruitment campaign, eh? I mean, let's be honest, if the Russian government went full Soviet authoritarian, they would have already formed 2 divisions filled with Central Asian recruits. Ah, good old times. In the end, it's hard to say how many Central Asians are fighting in the Russian armed forces. As you can see, a couple hundreds for sure. According to Ukrainian sources, so take it with a pinch of salt, as of December 2023, 61 Uzbeks and 50 Tajiks had been KIA at the front as part of the Russian army. My guess is that at least half of all the foreign recruits in the Russian armed forces come from Central Asia. Now, since we're talking about Asia, let's talk about Russia's best ally, China. As you can see on screen, there's also a number of Chinese citizens that signed contract with the Ministry of Defense. Wait, let me do a special headline. Too many Russian losses. The PLA is now joining the fight in Ukraine. Not really. You'll be disappointed. As a little historical note, you have to remember that between 20,000 and 40,000 Chinese citizens fought for the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. They played a crucial role in counterinsurgency operations, mostly because of their cruelty. Now back to the Ukraine war. We have the very interesting testimonial of Li Jianwei, a former Chinese army soldier that enlisted in Russia.
所以他妈的这他妈巷战跟我想象中不一样。我想象中的巷战，第一梯队12个人，2个战斗小组，实际上可以划分4个战斗小组，但是打巷战都是头一次，也是做支援吧，老兵新兵过去，我跟你说。 那边的阵亡率啊，就是人进入战场到基本上你死8到10个小时，就是这么快。
Then there's another one called Sun Ruiji. He posted the following video on Chinese social media Weibo. How it started.
全体都要听我口令，同志们好，同志们辛苦了，首战用我，用我必胜。
How it ended.
我会死在这里的，也请求广大的中国朋友们。
According to the latest news, Sun Ruiji left his unit, so he's a deserter, and hopelessly tried to get help from the Chinese embassy, but they essentially told him he had to finish his contract before coming back home. Just like with many other countries, it's important to note that Chinese citizens are prohibited by law from engaging in military activities for foreign countries. In theory, all of them could face prison upon their return. Contrary to popular belief, not all foreign fighters are sent directly into the trenches. As you can see here, this Chinese volunteer is part of some support unit of the Piatnashka brigade of the DPR. Fun fact, he uses an online translator to communicate with his officers. Overall, we have video evidence of about 50 Chinese citizens in the ranks of the Russian armed forces. But of course, there could be a little bit more. There is even this Japanese volunteer or mercenary, whatever you want to call it. The last samurai that also has to use Google Translate to swear his allegiance to Russia. Perhaps if the Russians were a little bit more organized, they could have followed the French Foreign Legion approach and make sure all the foreign recruits learn enough Russian to understand basic commands and work in combat teams before going to the front. Now that this is clear, we can move on to the next country, which is Nepal. Want to go home. This is what we heard the most recently about Nepali volunteers in the Russian military. According to CNN, by February 2024, Russia had recruited about 15,000 Nepalese citizens into its ranks. Knowing the fierce Gurkhas, if that was true, it would have already been GG well played for Ukraine. How many are actually fighting in Russia? I've read that 700 families have asked the government for help in bringing their relatives home from the front. So possibly up to 700 Nepali fighters. Meanwhile, other sources claim that Moscow was able to attract 150 to 200 Nepalese citizens into its paramilitary structure. And this seems to be more in line with the data from Nepal's foreign ministry that estimated that at least 200 of the country's citizens were fighting in Russian ranks, of which 14 were KIA. That is the data from May 1st. Since then, Nepal's government said at least 32 Nepali men were KIA fighting for Russia. How did they even get there? Well, since February 2022, over 1,700 Nepalese have gone to Russia on student or work visas. Like most of the foreign recruits, most joined for the money. The experience of Mr. Shahi basically confirms everything we've heard before. He'd make $2,200 a month as a contract soldier and get Russian citizenship as a reward for his service. From this article of the New York Times, there were hundreds of Nepalese on base. Mr. Shahi also mentioned he got 2 weeks of training only, which is similar to the experience of 35-year-old Ganesh.
For the first 2 weeks of training, life was good. But once we were sent to Ukraine, we didn't have enough food and were beaten by the Russians. It was really bad. It was very frightening. It wasn't man-to-man, bullet-to-bullet. We were attacked by drones, and it was terrifying.
Thing is, the Russians treat their own troops the same way. But yeah, 2 weeks basic training seems extremely low. This makes me believe these men were not even meant for frontline duties, but support roles at the rear. Then came the stories of how they escaped from the front after a Ukrainian artillery barrage in December. Mr. Shahi and a small group of Nepalis deserted from their combat positions. With the help of smugglers, he thought he would be able to return to Nepal. However, it was a trap by the Russian army and they were all arrested. The Nepalese even admitted that the Russian armed forces had no need of guys like them that didn't even want to be there. It got messy, but in the end, with more bribes, they eventually got out of the country. The New York Times spoke with 11 Nepalese that managed to escape. 11! So when we read headlines like Nepalese mercenaries desert from the Russian army en masse, no. As you can imagine, I think a lot of the problem stems from the fact that none of these men had actual military experience. In comparison, in an article by The Diplomat, we learned that a veteran from the Nepal army working as a security guard in Dubai was approached by Russian recruiters. He said he's now in a military training camp in Russia. Training is not hard for me as I have gone through similar training in Nepal army. But he also said, weapons here are more modern than what I would get in Nepal army training. That's when he stopped answering the questions of the journalist. So the experience really varies from one individual to another. Apart from Nepalese, there were also a significant number of recruits from India and Sri Lanka. On the 30th of May, Reuters reported Sri Lanka tightens control to stop men being duped into Ukraine fighting. It's funny how news agencies from all over the world use the same keywords lured, duped by Russian recruiters. I understand perhaps the terms and conditions were shady, but at the same time, nobody forced them to fly to Moscow. I don't know, maybe I'm too harsh. What do you think? In the end, Nepali authorities received complaints from about 280 families. In the end, Sri Lankan authorities received complaints from about 280 families. So we could think about 280 of their citizens went to fight in Ukraine for Russia. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka's foreign ministry did its own study, and according to their research, at least 37 Sri Lankans have been wounded in Ukraine and 16 others are missing, most likely KIA. Here you can see one of the Sri Lankan volunteers. In this Telegram post, they talk about a combat action that took place on the 15th of May. 3 of these Sri Lankan mercenaries ran to help a wounded Russian soldier, carrying him out of artillery fire. That's when FPV drones started to rain on them. They managed to pull the Russian soldier out of their line of sight, but they paid the price of their bravery. 2 of these Sri Lankans ended up in serious condition in the hospital, and the 3rd one fell on the battlefield. He's the one you can see on screen. What a tragedy, what a tragedy. Like everyone else, it's poverty that pushes these men to fight abroad. Russian recruiters specifically looked for retired military personnel, promising them over $2,000 a month, 13 times the average income in Sri Lanka. One of them spent 22 years in the commando regiment, but now as a 41-year-old, he was struggling to provide for his family. French media Hl 24 interviewed his wife. He left Sri Lanka in early April. In the end, she said she has no news from her husband since May 1st. At least 22 Sri Lankans who joined the Russian armed forces have managed to escape and return home. Of course, another mass desertion. Now let's take a look at India. There they speak of 50 families who have a relative that has been duped into the Ukraine war. Anyway, 50 recruits honestly is not that much, especially for a huge country like India. Honestly, I expected hundreds upon hundreds of recruits. I guess they can make more money in scammy call centers without risking their own skin.
He's being duped. He was supposed to be a helper, and they forced him into the war in Ukraine.
Sky News was shown multiple Russian Ministry of Defense contracts. It states the men must perform military duty and service to defend the Russian Federation.
But the 12th of June, according to the Time of India, we learned that 3 Indian men have been confirmed as KIA. One was 23 years old, another was 30, and the last one was 31. Yet, according to the latest news, the total is now 4 Indians KIA in Ukraine. The 30-year-old one, Teshpal Singh, had hopes to join the Indian army or the police force, but that didn't work out. But he knew several fellow Indians from the northern states of Haryana and Punjab that had already enlisted, and that convinced him to do the same thing. That's how in January Amristar traveled to Russia and signed a contract with the Russian armed forces. After basic training, he was posted near Tokmak on the Zaporozhye front. The months go by and Teshpal Singh's wife started to get concerned by the lack of communication. Her 2 children also kept asking for their father. One day she sent a copy of her husband's passport to the Russian embassy to see if they had more information. The next day she got the devastating news that Teshpal fell on the front sometime in March. Another one was Mohammed Imran. He complained to his family How can people who have never seen a gun only get 15 days of training? Sadly, he fell sometime in March 2024. Now we have to talk about the 23-year-old Hl. On the night of February 20th, he managed to call his parents, telling them he was at the front somewhere in Donetsk, but that overall things were okay. 2 days later, Himmel's parents got another call. They were happy and they immediately picked up the phone, but it wasn't their son speaking. A man identified himself in Hindi as Imran, saying Himmel has been KIA in a missile strike, probably caused by the fact that he called his parents and the Ukrainians intercepted this communication. We're going to end this video with the emblematic recruits from Africa. Check out this Telegram post. It says, in this picture you can see 4 members of the Russian army that have been captured. The curiosity is that among them there is an African soldier. The vast majority were students that were studying in Russia and decided to enlist for various reasons. Apparently, a total of 249 men from 14 countries in Africa went to fight in Ukraine. Some of them, like the one you can see on the left, are already famous on social media. His call sign is Vanya. He comes from Nigeria and he's now an artilleryman. He was a student at the Voronezh Polytechnic University, and now he's attached to the Terek Brigade of the DSHK, the volunteer assault corps that replaced the Wagner PMC. Together with Vanya, 3 other foreign students also enlisted, 2 Syrians and 1 Egyptian. Here's another Nigerian soldier from the Biafra region. Reuters investigated the story of 3 Africans that lived in Russia, 1 from Zambia, 1 from Tanzania, and the 3rd one from Côte d'Ivoire. For various crimes, they all ended up in jail, but joined Wagner during the massive prison inmate recruitment campaign. The one from Zambia fell on the 22nd of September 2022 while storming a Ukrainian trench. A month later, the Tanzanian one fell as well. As the one from Côte d'Ivoire, he completed his 6-month contract and then left the military. On the 11th of January, the Ukrainians captured this Somalian soldier near Marinka. Essentially, he said that many foreigners did not immediately understand that they were enlisting in the military and not some kind of security job. Anyway, here's what he had to say.
So when I applied in Kenya for a Russian tourist visa, within 1 week I got it. I was working for almost, you can say 3 months, 2 months and a half. After that, the payment is not good. Almost the same payment in Somalia, 150, 140. After that, I saw the signs everywhere in Russia about the army. I didn't know it's army. I thought like it's security job or something like you can manage with it. I called the number, they give me a location. I went to that location and I signed the contract.
In December 2023, Mogadishu-based radio station Kulmiye reported that at least 8 Somali citizens had been forcibly recruited into the Russian army to fight in Ukraine. Once again, it's not that many. Oh my god, actually, I remember this video from late December, and we actually see Private Mohammed Adil.
Я чуть-чуть русский. Хорошо. Adil Mohammed.
In the interview, Mohammed Adil also said that 3 servicemen of his battalion were from India. Imagine it's the guys I told you about, like Imran and Hemil.
And the same age. 120, he's 30 or someone 26 or something, 25.
In the end, we can safely say Russia's International Legion experiment was a flop. We can speak about the shady recruitment process which led to numerous diplomatic issues with Russia's allies. Then I'm not sure how recruiting simple civilians that could not even speak Russian would be beneficial from a military perspective. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.